Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
Tonight, we'll continue and hopefully complete our discussion of Jewish medical ethics that we began last week. And there are three issues that we have left to focus on. The first is the role of the patient in medical care. The second is the issue of euthanasia. And the third is the issue of abortion. It's enough for one night, right? But I think I once quoted to you Yogi Berra's famous statement, "Before I say anything, let me tell you something." So before I deal with these three issues, there's one point I'd like to make that relates to last week's discussion. And it came out of a point that one of you made. I think it was Dr. Yale. It's you, right? It came out of something you raised. Last week, after we discussed various popular contemporary methods of health care, if you remember, there was the World Health Organization, the WHO model, the biomedical model, and the therapeutic model. And after I had begun to offer a Jewish view of health care, the question was asked, or the statement was made, but you haven't mentioned the word ethics or morals for an hour and a quarter. Remember you said that?
Yes.
So I thought about that comment, and I realized that maybe the central point I was trying to make in that discussion wasn't clear. So I want to try to clarify that before we take a look at these three remaining issues. In previous meetings, I've tried to present various views of human nature. You remember the animal, the zoological model, the mechanical model, and the commodities model. And added to that, I would say there's a fourth model, the fatalistic model, namely the model that human beings lives are determined, and therefore they have no moral choice. Because if everything is determined, you have no moral choice. And I suggested that those models are pervasive in the history of Western thought, and then I tried to compare and contrast those models with a Jewish view of human nature. Furthermore, I tried to establish how and why there is a correlation, a relationship between views of human nature that one puts forth and views on ethical behavior and ethical expectations that one adapts. In other words, what I tried to argue is that from one perspective, views that one has on human nature lead you to certain consequences regarding expectations for moral behavior, and the opposite, namely moral systems rest on certain views of human nature. And therefore, I tried to argue that how one understands human nature is fundamental to any understanding of ethics. And therefore, the talking about human nature is a critical part of talking about ethics. Now, each of the models that I discussed as being currently pervasive in medical care also reflects a view of human nature. And the view of Jewish medical ethics has underlying it a view of human nature. Therefore, talking about these various models of medical care and contrasting them to a model for Jewishly oriented medical care really means talking about ethics, though not necessarily using the term ethics or morality. To put it another way, in ethical discourse there is the idea that we have what's called in philosophy meta-ethics, M-E-T-A, meta-ethics, that which is above ethics. In other words, the idea is that there are certain ideas and premises and views and norms upon which certain particular moral systems and kinds of behavior is based. And what I've been trying to suggest to you is that you really can't do ethics unless you first do metaethics. In other words, you can't deal with specific ethical issues until you first have established what are the ideas and norms and premises that you assume before even getting to those specific decisions in ethics. And that the view of human nature is one of those ideas that is critical to metaethics before you can even begin about talking about ethics. And that each model that I discussed assumes a certain view of the human being, namely the three models I suggested for medical concern today, the WHO model, the biomedical model, and the therapeutic model, and that all of those, or each of those three models, is rejected by the assumptions of Jewish ethics. And I want to give you now some specific examples. For instance, the biomedical approach has as its conceptual ancestor the theory of la mettrie that we already discussed, namely the theory of the human being as a machine. That's why I first began a few weeks ago discussing different views of human nature, to now begin to show how those views of human nature come to play when you're dealing with specific ethical issues. So, for example, if you take the approach, very dominant since the 17th century, that the human being is a kind of machine, and the body in particular is a kind of machine, that crystallizes in medical care in the biomedical model, where the body is viewed as a kind of machine, as a arrangement of different systems, and that when the systems malfunction, you have to then fix them. That approach is based on this idea that the human being, and particularly the human body, is a kind of machine, which is a model that goes right back conceptually, historically, to la Mettrie's view of the human being as a machine. Now, the implications of that, say for medical care, may, from one point of view, sound good, but if you allow it to play out, you see there are problems with it. One problem with it is, what analogy does that lead you to in terms of the role of the physician and the role of the patient and the nature of disease? In this view, the nature of disease is a kind of mechanical malfunction in the system. The physician becomes a kind of mechanic, and the patient becomes a kind of machine that is in need of repair. You add to that the third model that I discussed in terms of views of human nature in the course of Western thought, namely the commodity or the economic model, where the human being is viewed as a kind of economic commodity. You put that together with the machine model, and what you have is a conclusion that when it becomes not cost effective anymore to repair the system, then the human being's life has no value. And so what I want to suggest is that this approach contrasts very sharply with the approach of the nature of the human being that we have in Jewish sources, as I think is clear. And that therefore two very different models of medical care then emerge from the underlying premise, which is, what is the nature of the human being? So I hope that's a little more clear. Or to take the other model, the therapeutic model. This is based on an idea of determinism. This is based on the idea of a person as a victim. This is based on the idea that everybody is sick and that we are all victims of some external force or some external experience that makes us sick. And therefore we have no responsibility for it. We have no responsibility for having contracted it, and we have no responsibility for trying to cure it. And that in the deterministic model here, as in every other place, leads you to the same conclusion, which is if the person has no choice, then the person cannot be held responsible for their deeds. So I think here again you see that the concept you have, the nature of the human being, the model of healthcare that you adapt, leads you to certain concrete positions of moral choice that juxtapose very sharply with the Jewish approach. The third model, namely the World Health Organization definition, has been criticized by many people as trying to reduce health to social issues. In other words, it's been criticized as trying to move an individual's health problems to the socio and political realm, and to say that if people are sick, it's not because they have very much to do with it. It's because society is messed up, and the way we're going to improve health is to correct society. The problem with that argument is that if the society is responsible for every bad thing that goes on inside of that society, including the illness of individuals, then the individuals have no possibility of correcting their situation and have no obligation to correct their situation. And here too we see a juxtaposition with the Jewish view. Now the final model is the economic model, which I already mentioned a little bit. Here you would reach a point in terms of the role of the physician, in terms of delivery of health care, where the patient would be viewed simply as an economic commodity. And the major issue then in health care would be how much is the patient paying for the health care, or how much is being paid for the patient for the health care, and whether we can deliver a form of health care that we can make money on. And I'll give you an example which appeared, I think it was in Time magazine or Newsweek, it was on the television too, which is maybe an extreme example, but which is an actual example today in the increasingly managed care system. There was a woman who contracted an infection in her leg, and she went to the doctor, and the doctor said, well, we can treat this with drugs, but it's a very rare kind of infection, and the drugs are very expensive, and it'll cost $9,000 to treat you. So he sent into she said, but I better check with your carrier to see if they're going to cover it. He sent in the report to the insurance carrier. The insurance carrier sent it back, a note, and the note said, we will not pay this because there is a more effective treatment at a lower cost. So he calls the health carrier, and he says, I don't know of any more effective treatment at a lower cost. And the health carrier says, amputation. Oh. And in certain, medical systems, say like the Canadian medical system, you have the situation where certain kinds of treatment is considered too expensive under that system to do. So, for example, in the British system, and less so, but getting there in the Canadian system, for example, it's almost impossible, say, for people over a certain age, say 50 or 55, to get, for instance, dialysis. Because it's not considered cost-effective at that age to keep them alive. So they have to then go some other route. So here is an economic model that's based on the idea of the human being as a kind of commodity, which we discussed earlier, and that has direct implications for how healthcare is delivered, for the nature of the role of the physician, for the role of the patient, for the relationship between the two, because the patient would eventually come to the conclusion that he has to, or she has to think, is the physician doing what's best for my health, or is it the physician doing best for, their economic condition, which is a problem in all professions. So I hope, that this is now clarified why I didn't use the term ethics or morality explicitly, but it was all there implicitly. And this is the line of argument that I'm trying to make. Namely, you have to begin a discussion of ethics with meta-ethics. You have to begin with the premises and the norms and the assumptions that a system of ethics is based on before you can even begin to discuss any concrete issue in ethics. And I know many people who are teaching ethics today and who study ethics today begin the opposite way. In other words, they begin with, the case studies. Say an abortion case study or euthanasia case study in medical ethics or reproductive biotechnology case study. But it seems to me that the medieval approach has some merit. And the medieval approach is you first establish your premises. And then you see how those premises play out in concrete situations. And the second agenda I have running here, in case it's not already clear, is to try to show that there are different ethical systems. There are different modes of ethical discourse. And Judaism is one of them. I happen to be prejudiced in its favor. I mean, I'm trying to show it's not only one of them, it's better than the others. But you can decide yourself. But the ones that I'm comparing it to are not random ones. They're the ones that really dominate Western thought. Yes, sir.
Isn't there a problem of idolatry here in some of the things you've hinted at? You talk about the physician who wanted to spend some resources on this lady's leg. The other fellow said it's more cost-effective to amputate. The implication is that the economic model failed, and it's a horror and a crime. The society has another good item, namely it likes to advance education. Education is a wonderful, fine commodity. The resources of society, let's assume, are not adequate to have absolutely the finest education for every single living person, and simultaneously absolutely the finest medical care for anybody else. At what point do you bargain between these two wonderful things? If you make the body and you decry the physician who was economizing, haven't you escalated?
That's a very good question, because it's a very current question, and I would answer it in two ways. The first way is the physician was making in this case that I mentioned, the physician was making a decision based on their best medical judgment. The person they talked to was not a physician. The person they talked to was a bureaucrat in an insurance company that has no idea of medical care at all. So it's not comparing apples and apples. So this is the problem. The problem is when the people who are determining what is the best medical care are not people that understand it. I have physician friends of mine tell me when they call up the insurance companies or some of the other carriers and they tell them what treatment they're prescribing, the person on the other end of the line doesn't even know how to spell it. So should these people be making the decisions? Now, the other question you raise, which is the more vital question, it seems, is the resource question, allocation of resource question. And there is a tremendous literature on this issue. And it's all based on the assumption that we have diminishing resources. And therefore, since we have diminishing resources, the question is, should we spend it on this or should we spend it on that? My feeling is a bit of a maverick position. My feeling is that we have enough resources, but we're not allocating them well. And if we allocated them well, we wouldn't really have the problem. And let me give you a very simple example, because you mentioned education, an area that I know a little bit about. You take a look at American education. I don't want to go off for a whole discussion of American education. But you take a look at American education, and what you find is we're in terrible shape. Let's just take the sciences and mathematics. Compared to other countries, we're in terrible shape. This is a fact. I can bring you, documentation for it, but compared to other countries, we're in terrible shape. The SATs now, they let the scores were so low, they let the students now bring calculators to the class to try to up the scores. They're giving the students now more points for writing their name. They used to give them 200, now they give them 250 for the SATs. Because the scores have been going down. Science, study came out a few weeks ago, was reported in U.S. News and World Report. 65% of the teachers in our schools teaching science never took a science class in college. Believe this?
Sure.
65% of the so we're in trouble in science. We're in a global economy now. We're competing with other countries around the world. American students don't have math, don't have science. Of course, history, they certainly don't have. Geography, they also don't have. How can you deal in a global economy if you don't know where, anything is? You don't know where Europe is, So we have a problem in education. I spent a lot of time the last number of years in Eastern Europe on lecture tours. And in Eastern Europe, since the collapse of communism, the educational systems are up for grabs. They don't have money to give the teachers chalk. And yet, their students are better than ours in mathematics. So don't tell me it's a resource problem. It's not a financial resource problem. Jews in Eastern Europe had the highest literacy. Right? I mean, that's no myth, it's no secret. Jews in Eastern Europe were learning a lot. And they were not living in the same standard of living that we're living here now. Yet they managed to learn something. So I don't buy the argument that education is linked to financial resources. That's always the argument in this country. If you want to solve a problem, throw money at it. We've had a lot of problems. We've thrown a lot of money. We've thrown about $2 trillion against the poverty in this country. You have more now than before. So it seems to me that throwing the money and saying we have scarcity of resources has not been very effective. The question is how to allocate the resources we have in the most effective way. And this, I think, is certainly true in medical care, an area that I know less about than education. When I hear about, say, people coming, elderly people coming, and they say they have a pain in the ankle, and they're sending thousands of these people at $1,200 a shot for CAT scans and billing the government for this, does it make sense to you?
They don't look at a lawsuit.
Pardon me?
If the doctor doesn't send for the MRI, the doctor will be sued. That's not the point.
This is the point. The point is that we have X amount of money, and it's not being utilized in the right way. So I am not willing to buy into the argument that everybody always makes that, we have a scarcity of resources, and therefore do you spend it for this one or do you spend it for that one? First, I want to look at the resources we have. We're now spending, as I mentioned last week or the week before, almost 20% of our gross national product in medical care. Are we getting our investment? Are we getting a return on our investment? If you were an investment counselor and you were getting back a return on your investment, say in some investment in some company, some stock, that we're getting back on spending a fifth of our gross national product, you wouldn't continue to hold that stock, I'm sure. So why are we continuing to hold the stock? That's the question. It's not, in my view, an issue of allocation. I don't want to discuss, different health plans here, but I really don't understand this line of argument.
Well, what is it that motivates these people in Europe to learn more and be more?
First of all, it's part of the culture.
Why can't we do the same here?
We can do the same here, but we're not doing the same
What
here.
is it? It's something that's...
You're asking me why I think the American school system is failing? Is that what you're asking? Because I have an answer.
Why it's succeeding in Europe?
It's succeeding in Europe because, number one, they have a tradition of learning for the sake of learning. Number two, they see it as a way of getting advancement. Number three, they have a class system. I'm going to use the dirty word, elite. The goal is to become a member of the intelligentsia, which is the intellectual elite, because that's the upper stratum of society. In America, we don't have this class system. We don't have an intelligentsia, and the intelligentsia is always demeaned. So it's a whole different thing. Our position in this country is that, it seems to me, if you learn something in order to do something, you don't learn something in order to know something. And the argument for education, I even saw it on Charles Barkley said it on the news the other night, is to get a job, which is a good reason for education, but not the only reason for education. The original idea of a college education, of the liberal arts education, was to create a certain kind of person, a certain kind of cultured and refined person with certain civilities. This is no longer part of the game here. My view of why the American education system has collapsed is a very simple one, and you can agree with me or disagree with me or have your own theory. I see as one of the dominant approaches in American education today the approach that says the goal of education is to make the student feel good about themselves. Because the underlying assumption is that if the people feel good about themselves, they will have higher academic performance. This is a dominant view in American education today. Speak to any educator. The only problem is all of the studies, I'll put it the other way, there is not one single study done that verifies this view. And the opposite, there are studies that completely contradict this view and show that the students with lower esteem do better because they have something to aim for. And the students with high esteem figure, well, everything's cool. And then you have the view that we shouldn't have competition because it means somebody's not going to feel good about themselves. So now in many schools, there are no more grades. Many schools, they have no more intramural sports. So now you have schools sending transcripts to colleges for admissions. How is the college going to determine which are the better students if there are no grades, if there's no competition, and if the student who excels is not allowed to excel because his excelling may make the student who can excel not feel good about himself? This, it seems to me, is a dominant mentality in American education that, in my view, has destroyed American education. You can't give a student a failing grade. They might not feel good about themselves. So if everybody gets an A or everybody has no grade, so I really don't think it's a question of allocation of resource. I think it's a question of allocation of thought, that we have to rethink the system, because the system is breaking down. And in my view, a lot is riding on the system, especially for our country, because we're in a global situation now. We're competing around the world. And, you know, I speak to people, say, who own engineering firms. They tell me, the new engineers coming out, they can't write a proposal. So they write a proposal to build a bridge, and they can't write. So how do you know the bridge is not going to fall down? There are big law firms now with graduates from Harvard, Yale Law School with remedial writing classes in the law firms because they can't write a brief. They're billing out $250 an hour. They can't write a page. So they have remedial writing now in the law firms, in the medical firms. Now, how are we going to expect to compete in a global market with this kind of education? It's not going to happen. We're going to be in big trouble. And, well, I'm not going to go into any more. I've said enough already. Too much already. Mr. Zoltan, please do.
I have some knowledge of the healthcare delivery system in America. And I'm no fan of managed care, but I don't. In a global view, I think you could have anecdotes of fee-for-service where there's horrendous outcomes also, like the one you gave.
Absolutely.
My main point is, I believe you have to start with an asset base. Got so many beds, so many skilled nursing facilities, so many technicians, so many, at any one point in time, take a slice of time, so many practitioners. I think it's fair to say that at any point in history, a healthcare system, a national healthcare system, has always been a selective system through whatever means it's operating, whether it's the anecdote you gave or any other anecdote. Everybody did not get all the care they needed at any time. And I believe that whether the model we're moving under now with managed care, which I don't think will come to its fruition because I think it's flawed, but it's just another method of allocating care among individuals. But given that, and even forgetting about that, but if you just take a look at the assets available for people to receive health care, I don't think that the assets available at any time will fill the demand. And I think that's a fair assumption, either because of distribution or absolute demand or some other skewed mechanism that's going in place. So given that, shouldn't any ethical model have to account for the fact that there's going to be selectivity and not everybody's going to get the best health care possible? When we take a look at our models, shouldn't we also build on the fact that what is the most ethical way to make these decisions, to triage? Because I think if you start off saying, forget about the assets in place to provide the care, let's assume that it's all there, I don't think then necessarily you're going to really meet the ethical system you come up with is going to meet the real challenge that people are going to face, that the ethical system should have to address the hard decisions.
I agree with your conclusion, but I don't agree with your premise. I agree with the conclusion because, as I mentioned a number of times, one of the things, in my view, that differentiates, say, Jewish ethics from Christian ethics is that Jewish ethics is a messy ethics. Christian ethics is a messianic ethics. In other words, Christian ethics sort of assumes a messianic redeemed world where everything is wonderful, and when you then juxtapose the reality against that assumption, you come to disastrous results, where we begin by assuming that it's a messy world, a pre-messianic world, a non-redeemed world, and that things aren't going to work out perfectly and that every system is going to be flawed. So we begin, from that place, I agree. But in terms of your premises about calculating or assessing the assets, this is exactly my problem. Because if you look at the way healthcare is going now in this country, as far as I see it, we see an almost deliberate diminishing of assets.
That's not supportable.
It's not supportable?
No, I mean...
When it's being predicted that half of the hospitals in the country may close, those are our assets.
Well,
when nurses are being replaced with what's called care buddies, when practicing nurses are being replaced by care buddies who are low-paid attendants, that's not diminishing our assets?
Well, not necessarily. First of all,
Tell it to those nurses who are getting fired, I don't have to deal with that.
It's movement. There was a time that LPNs and RNs were doing things that physicians were doing. They're looking towards it. I don't want to defend the model necessarily because I believe it's going to bounce back from where it's going. And I think there's a lot of people who also think that. But a lot of the assets that were in place in the 50s and the 60s that have the beds that have been closed were probably inappropriately funded and staffed. And I think...
But we have trained people. Should we tell them, go take a job at McDonald's?
I don't think McDonald's is the only choice any more than people at Lockheed who are working on B-2 bombers. Their only choice of their training was to go to McDonald's. The healthcare system has flawed delivery. Has flawed delivery right now. I mean, I go over to Mount Sinai, and I see less resources for more need, and I go to some other places like Russia's new building, and I see extravagance. Now, it's a distribution issue, all within 7 blocks of each other. But it is a distribution issue in a sense. But that doesn't change the kind of choices the people at Mount Sinai have to make, the ethical choices they have to make. And they have to live in the world they're in, and they have to make ethical choices. And I think it's messy, but I think that an ethical system should have to account for and point out and give direction to people who are in those positions that have to make those kind of choices. Even though in a macro sense you would say, well, that shouldn't exist. Or am I...
I'm not saying it shouldn't exist. I'm just starting at where we are. No, I'm starting where we are. We have almost an oversupply, according to some of doctors.
Certain kinds of doctors.
Certain kinds of doctors. Mostly specialists, which happens to be the great strength of the American medical system, which is why people from other countries come here for medical care that they can't get elsewhere because we have this. There's a move to shut that down. There's a move to shut down all foreign physicians. There's a move to shut down half of the medical schools. There's an article in the Chronicle of Higher Education. We should shut down half of the medical schools.
Because there's too many doctors.
Because there's too many doctors, and there will be even more too many doctors.
See,
These seem to me to be assets, not liabilities, that we should build on.
The countervailing part of that is weight is being felt right now. Like at Johns Hopkins, U of C, and the customers that I call on, the political weight is moving against that. And I think you'll see if you watch Pendulum over 5 years, you're not going to see the managed care model, which would reward the shutting down.
I agree with you. And why is it moving that way? Because of the political. And what's the political? That the majority of the people in this country who have influence and who vote are elderly.
Either way, the system in and of itself moved towards the DRG system and the other systems that started hurting the medical schools. The system itself is now moving against it. It's like the balance you generally talk about in ethics, and I think the country in its healthcare system is starting to balance against that. But
well, you could argue that way. I don't accept the argument, but I can understand the line of argument. I don't accept the argument, even based on your premises, which is a typical management premise, which is let's build on our net comparative advantages. So, in my view, we're destroying our net comparative advantages.
Demand exceeds the supply, and you deny that basically at a price, at a zero price, at a zero cost, which is what you're basically arguing for.
No, I'm arguing why dismantle the good stuff and keep the bad stuff when we have good stuff.
Because it now won't take 20% of the nation's resources, but 25%.
No, but we already have it. We already have it.
I think the easiest way to kind of clear this up is to say we have an economic model and it's going to persist for a long, long time.
Well, it's very possible.
You don't have an economic model. When you're going in deficit where we are, and we're going to be cutting back on services in the next decade, if it was economic, we would be looking at the problem today.
Well, but I mean,
I know what you mean.
Economic
I know, but
in
it's
terms
not
of,
in a realistic term that they're
well,
looking at the economic.
in terms of the fact that the health professionals they've lost control of the system.
But there's so much waste in the system. If you know anybody who works, my wife was an X-ray technician, and there's so much waste in the system. You gave one example. Somebody sprains a finger and they give them a CAT scan. She had to quit because of what they did to the elderly. They would run for any reason 1 million tests. And I have a friend who's a doctor, and that's all she does after the elderly. And she cried. We're just wasting resources.
Well, let me let the cat out of the bag here in terms of the real issue that Mr. Zoldan is raising, which doesn't simply have to do with medical ethics. It has to do with... I'm confused too. But I mean the general issue with dealing with ethical choice, because you said we have to make ethical decisions, and it's not so simple. It seems to me that one of the major goals of an ethical system, or in my view also should be a social political system, is to determine or to shape what kind of ethical choices we should make as opposed to other ethical choices. In other words, let me give you an example. You remember the book Sophie's Choice? Okay? So here is a mother in a Nazi concentration camp, and she's told by the Nazi, you decide, here you have two children, I have to shoot one, you decide which one. If you don't decide, I'll shoot them both. So I would say that the goal of society, or the goal of ethics, is to create a society where certain kinds of choices, like that kind of choice, don't have to be made. In other words, the goal of ethics is to elevate the kind of choices that we have to make. And that, it seems to me, is across the board. The issue really isn't this kind of medical care, that kind of medical care, or this social program or that social program. The issue, it seems to me, is to create a kind of society or environment where people should not have to make certain kinds of moral choices.
Well, someone eventually has to make it. I mean, it may not be active, but it's the basis. It's
No, I'm saying there shouldn't be a society, say, where a guy says to a mother, choose this child or that child, or I'll kill both of them. That we should not allow such a society to exist. That's what I'm talking about. You know, the horrendous type of choices. Because when society loses ethical foundation, that's what happens. All right, now I'm ready to go to issue number one. So this was all appetizers, warm-ups. The role of the patient. We have in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 9, a biblical injunction, which in Hebrew says, Shmor nafshecha ma'od. Shmor means guard, or take care of. Nafshecha means yourself. And ma'od literally means a lot. It's sort of an emphatic form. So you would translate it something like, take good care of yourself. This phrase is taken by the post-biblical Jewish commentators to mean that the patient, that the person, has both significant responsibility for his or her health care as well as a significant role in his or her health care. It is taken by the commentators to mean that the person must be enjoined not to endanger themselves through lifestyle choices. In other words, not to do certain things that would put the person in danger, or to remove dangers that are already present in their lifestyle choices. Rather than, say, taking a therapeutic model and saying, well, I really don't have any choice over my lifestyle. You know, I'm this way because I have this syndrome, or I have this or that. Secondly, this verse is interpreted to mean that the person is required to seek medical care when necessary, and not to wait until the condition reaches a crisis state where the medical care has to be brought to them. And thirdly, the person is urged to preserve their health when it's present, to dispel illness when it's present, and to prevent illness when it's absent. In other words, part of this package is what we call today preventative medicine. And I'll have more to say about that in a minute. This approach is based on an assumption that is not totally popular today. especially amongst feminists. And this is the assumption, which is really a theological assumption, that the individual does not own their own body, but rather that the body is given to us by God, and our job is to be a steward, a caretaker of what is loaned to us as a gift or a loan, or if you want a more technical term, as a bailment from God. As we'll discuss later when we discuss the issue of abortion, the general categories that we work in, say in Anglo-American tradition, don't apply in Jewish tradition. We don't have the same vocabulary. And the major word in Anglo-American jurisprudence is the word rights. Almost everything in Anglo-American jurisprudence has to deal with rights. Do you have the right? What happens? What does the right mean? What happens if there's a conflict of rights? That's Anglo-American jurisprudence. In Jewish thought, we hardly even have such a concept. There's no term for rights. Obligation. I'll get back to it later. But, pardon me? Zechut doesn't mean rights. Zechut means a permission. Zechut isn't a right. In modern Hebrew, it's a right, but not in classical Hebrew. But if we can't determine what Hebrew really is by the way it's spoken in Israel today. That's a whole other issue. But in Jewish legal literature, we do not really have a concept of rights. I'm going to get back to that later when we discuss abortion. But here it's pertinent because the argument always is, I have a right to do with my body whatever I want. That's my body, my right. In English, we even say, my body. Who is the my that owns the body? My body. In Jewish thought, we have the idea that the body is sort of on loan, and it's on loan to us by God, and therefore we have to take care of it. Just like if somebody gives you a loan or a bailment, you have to take care of it. That leads to the obvious question, how do we do it? What is the obligation of the person in terms of the care of their own body? First, part of the prescription is to eliminate illness when present. And here, the person, in the role of the patient, plays an active role in the curative process. And as I mentioned to you before, one of the arguments in Jewish law very early, already in the Middle Ages, is that there is a commandment in the Bible that if somebody loses something, you have to restore it to that person, return it to that person. That's restitution. And this biblical idea is used as the basis for health care. Namely, you had health, you lost the health, you're now ill, so you have to restore the health. So you have the obligation to restore your own health. The physician has the obligation to try to restore your health. As if the physician, say, finds something that belongs to you, has to restore it to you. He has to go try to find your health and restore it to you. But the patient also has the obligation to try to restore their own health, which is a kind of lost object. Now, it's interesting that Maimonides, who was not only the greatest Jewish philosopher of the Middle Ages, but also one of the greatest legal authorities and physicians, discusses medical issues about the preservation of health and the restoration of health and the prevention of disease in his legal code, the Mishnah Torah, and not simply in his medical writings. This is significant because the fact that Maimonides includes these medical discussions in his legal code shows that he considers the health regimen to be a requirement of Jewish law, and not simply a matter of advice, that it is a religious obligation for the person to try to preserve their health when present and to seek a cure when absent. In other words, in Maimonides' view, health is a religious obligation. Why? First, because, as I already mentioned, the idea that the body is on loan from God. So we have an obligation to God to take care of what he loans us. Secondly, the idea that the body is the instrument through which we worship God, through which we achieve, for Maimonides, the higher perfections than the perfection of the body, namely, for Maimonides, for example, the perfection of the soul, which he equates with leading the moral life. In other words, Maimonides argues that if the person is sick all the time, they don't take care of themselves, they can't then ascend to the next rung in the ladder of human development, which is moral perfection. Say if a person is in pain all the time, then they're not going to think about the development of the moral virtues. And you find an interesting parallel in Maimonides' writings about health of the body, which for him is the second level in the ladder of perfection, the ladder of human development, and moral development, which is that he says, what is health of the body? There's two parts: dispelling illness and inculcating health. And when he talks about perfection of the soul, or what he calls moral perfection, he says the same thing. That you have to dispel moral vice and inculcate moral virtue. So there's a kind of medicine for the soul. And as a matter of fact, the translator of Maimonides' guide, Ibn Aknin, even wrote a book called The Hygiene of the Soul. That just as there's a hygiene of the body, there is a hygiene of the soul. And the third reason why, in his view, health is an religious obligation is because health of the body is never viewed in Jewish sources as an end in itself. It is always viewed as a means to a higher end. The problem becomes if it becomes an end in itself. Because remember last week, I mentioned to you there are two words used in medieval Hebrew for health. Shleimut, from the word shalem, meaning complete, and briut, from the word bara, meaning creative. That the body becomes the vehicle toward achieving wholeness and toward achieving creativity, but the health of the body alone doesn't get you there. The health of the body is a means to those ends and not an end in itself. And now I want to give you Maimonides' six-point plan for health care. I'm sure if he were alive today, he would be on television and have a book and health clubs and whole big business, but he didn't. Maimonides outlines 6 things a person should be concerned about in terms of the prevention of disease and the preservation of health. And these are listed in a number of places in his works, but very clearly in one of his medical treatises. He wrote his medical treatises toward the end of his life. They were all written in Arabic. Strangely, they were preserved, the manuscripts, mostly, not all, but mostly by the Vatican Library. And they were translated, some of them into Latin, and now most of them are translated into English. And one of these medical, medical treatises, which is called the Treatise on Asthma, even though it has very little to do with asthma, he gives you his 6-point plan, which is also found in another form in his Mishnah Torah and also in another one of his medical treatises on the preservation of health, and sprinkled throughout his other writings. The first point in his medical plan, I'll put it this way, you need 6 things. There are 6 items here that you need for the preservation of health and the dispelling of illness. The first thing, and I'm not listing this in any priorities, that he discusses, which is very, very surprising since he's writing about 800 years ago, more than 800 years ago, is clean air. He writes about air pollution. In the treatise on asthma, he writes as follows about air pollution. It is well known that clean, fresh air, free of any contamination, is advisable for all people, whether healthy or whether sick. And later on in the treatise on asthma, he goes into a little more detail where he says, the relation between the air in a town and its streets and that found in the open country may be compared to the relation between grossly contaminated filthy water and its clear, lucid counterpart. Town air, I mean city air, is stagnant, turbid, and thick, the natural results of its big buildings, narrow streets, the refuse of its inhabitants, food gone bad, and the like. This air the winds carry stealthily into the houses, and many a person becomes ill without even noticing it. However, when escape seems impossible, after one has grown up in the city and become used to its ways, one should at least choose for a residence a wide open site facing the northeast, preferably on a steep, wooded mountainside and far from ponds and marshes where mosquitoes dwell. Should it be impossible to move to another town, a suburban residence to the north or south is the next best thing. Your living quarters are best located on the upper floor, giving a wide exposure to the wind and ample sunshine. Toilets should be located as far as possible from living rooms. The air should be kept dry at all times by sweet scents, fumigation, and drying agents. The concern for clean air is the foremost rule in preserving the health of the body and the soul. So this is written, let's say, about the year 1200, something like this.
The patient has nothing to do. I can't do anything about that.
Yes, he can. He can determine where he lives. Has to go move to Highland Park. It's in the northeast corner or whatever. The second part of Maimonides' prescription, he writes a lot about, and especially in the Mishnah Torah, his legal code, and that is diet. Maimonides in the Mishnah Torah, which is, after all, his legal code, so it's like a kind of kashrut for health, I'll put it this way, gives you a whole diet. He lists all the foods. And if you analyze his list, what you find essentially is a very high fiber, low fat diet. Now, Maimonides links the regulation of diet, which is related to the body, health of the body, to gluttony, which in his view is a moral vice related to the health of the soul. In other words, there is a clear relationship, in his view, and most of the medieval's views, between the body and the soul. So gluttony, for him, is not only an abuse of diet, it's, in his view, also a moral abuse. In other words, the person who is gluttonous affects not only their physical health, but also their moral health. Here's some things from his treatise on asthma on diet. But if you want to see his actual diet, maybe it's better than, what's her name? Who's doing one of it? Jenny Craig. Probably cheaper too. You can read in his Mishnah Torah, the Book of Knowledge, which is the first book of the 14 books of the Mishnah Torah, Hilchot Deot, Laws of Behavior. Is there a whole discussion of the diet business? But in the treatise on asthma, he says as follows. Doctors have laid down the following rule, that a person should stop eating before he experiences a sense of nausea. That is, as soon as he satisfies his appetite, they should stop eating. Even if the person stays a little hungry after finishing the meal, they should stop eating. Because if an animal, like a horse or a donkey or a camel, to which no self-limiting rules were taught, can take the exact measure of its fullness and not overstep it, how then can a person, human person, fail to know their proper food intake and take more food than they can possibly cram down into themselves until it sticks in their throat?
He's been to New Orleans.
No, he's been to bar mitzvahs and weddings, Jewish weddings. He says, I have seen gluttons who throw their food and poke it back into their mouth like ruminating beasts. Now comes the important sentence. This is one of the biggest causes of many diseases. Maybe one other quote here. Don't forget the other quote. The third aspect of his plan, which he doesn't discuss very much in the treatise on asthma, but in the guide he does, is exercise. And in the Mishnah Torah, this is what Maimonides writes about exercise. He says, if a person leads a sedentary life and does not take exercise, neglects the call of nature, or is constipated, even if he eats wholesome food and takes care of himself with medical rules, he will throughout his life be subject to aches and pains, and his strength will fail him. So here, to go back to your example before of the middle way, the golden mean, here Maimonides takes the position that exercise is good, exercise is necessary, too little is no good, but too much is also dangerous. The fourth item in his health regimen, which you could probably already figure out from the quote I just read, has to do with excretion, proper functioning of the excretory system, of the urinary tract and the bowels. And here I want to refer to a text that appears in the, two texts that appear in the Talmud, which you might find a little bizarre. I think you will find a little bizarre. A number of years ago, I was working on a book together with a Catholic nun for a Catholic press on, we were trying to put together a book of readings, prayers for Thanksgiving. Because in many communities they have interreligious services for Thanksgiving. So we were trying to put together an interfaith prayer book. And we did, and it was published, it's called Thank God. And thank God we published it. And we were meeting with the editor. The editor is an editor of this Catholic press, liturgy training publications. And our job, each of us, the nun and I, she's a professor at Loyola, we're supposed to come with prayers, thanking God for different things. So he said, I want you to collect different kinds of prayers, thanking God for food, thanking God for this, thanking God for that. And now, he says, people are interested in things related to the body. So maybe you have a body prayer in your tradition. So I came with a body prayer. They couldn't find one, Catholics. They don't have, they're not big on the body. So I read him the prayer. Now I'm going to read you this prayer. It's from the Talmud. And then I asked him, when do you think we recite this prayer? He couldn't guess, and when I told him, he just couldn't believe it. Here's the prayer. It's in the Talmud and the Tractate Brachot, which is the Tractate on Blessings. Blessed are you, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who formed human beings in wisdom, and created in them many orifices and ducts. It is revealed and known before the throne of your glory that if one of these be opened, or one of them closed, that it would be impossible to exist and to stand before you, God. Blessed are you, God, who heals all flesh and who performs wonders. That's the blessing. It's a beautiful blessing. No, it's about, you say this when you go to the bathroom. This is the bathroom blessing. You didn't see Fiddler on the Roof? There's a prayer for everything, right? We have a bathroom prayer.
Well, they're Masonic. They don't do.
Did you say Masonic or Messianic? So I told him, this is our bathroom prayer. He couldn't believe this. It was inconceivable in Catholic mind to have such a body prayer, prayer for going to the bathroom. But we have it.
It's in the book then, I assume.
It's in the book. It doesn't. It just gives the Talmudic source. It doesn't say when you say this. We have a section called Prayers Thanking God for the Body. So they couldn't find the Catholic prayer. Finally, they had to find some old Irish folk song or something like this, or Celtic folk song or some Celtic song. Now here's a Talmudic proverb, which they didn't let me put in the book. One who prolongs their stay in the bathroom prolongs their days and years. So in other words, here you have the view. It means don't rush it.
I thought it meant quantity.
No, nothing to do with quality, not quantity.
You're talking about time.
I'm talking about quality time. Quality time. Keep stuff to read there. But on the other hand, Maimonides says in the Mishnah Torah, one should not neglect the call of nature, but respond immediately. Because if you retain when you shouldn't retain, then you can cause other problems. So, for already the Talmud, certainly for Maimonides, the fourth important component of the health regimen is the proper functioning of the excretory system. The fifth part of the prescription has to do with sleep. And here again you have the middle way, not too much and not too little. Now, I just read a review, I forgot who wrote it. There's a new book out that more people suffer from sleep deprivation problems or sleep disorders than suffer from most diseases. And that more people are dysfunctional at work, not because they're sick or they're alcoholics or something like this, but because they have sleep disorders. And that we'd all be better off if we got our sleep act together. So Maimonides is already discussing this in the treatise on asthma. And the sixth component, which you have here a very direct link between the body, for Maimonides, the body and the soul, is what he would call the regulation of the emotions. In other words, that the ability to deal with one's emotions affects the health of the body. And conversely, the body affects the emotions, which could then affect the person's moral character. So, for example, if you're uncontrollably short-tempered, this for him is a bad situation. That affects the health of the body, raises the stress and all the things with that, but also affects the moral character. So what he prescribes, following Aristotle, is the golden mean, to try to find in the emotions some kind of moderation. But there are certain areas that he sees in terms of the emotions to be extremely dangerous. And amongst them, for instance, are mood swings, radical mood swings. And particularly, radical mood swings that leave the person in a state of worry and depression. Let me give you some examples here. From the treatise on asthma. The philosophical virtues guard a person against extreme moral states. They keep a person from falling into brutish emotionalism on mournful or joyous occasions, as happens with the ignorant multitude. See, he was an elitist too. A man so treated reveals his mental state by resorting to friendly counsel, not by a show of explosive action, enervated anguish, and the like. The same effects are possessed by moral and ethical teaching. A person should take easily the world and its phenomena and what passes for luck and ill luck. In reality, these are like nothing. They are hardly to be noticed. This is the equanimity we discussed 2 weeks ago. There is no comfort in the one nor alarm in the other. In the world of our mind, they are nothing more than ludicrous, idle specters which vanish away. That's not the quote I wanted. Let's see if I got the quote I wanted. No, I can't find it. No. Now, even though Maimonides lists these 6 things, he also has a 7th that he doesn't list as one of the things in the treatise on asthma, but he lists elsewhere. That is very critical to the health regimen, and this has to do with habits. One of the big themes throughout Maimonides' philosophical work and moral work and medical work has to do with habits. And here you have the same kind of argument regarding health of the body and health of the soul. Namely, the goal is the removal of the bad and the inculcation of the good. In terms of habits, the removal of bad habits and the inculcation of good habits. Now, the reason Maimonides, besides simply that he observed this as a problem in his life, but philosophically, theologically, the reason Maimonides put such a big emphasis on the issue of habit, particularly bad habit, is because for Maimonides, the major thing, the major characteristic of the human being is that the human being is a free moral agent. And for Maimonides, the major feature of Judaism is that Judaism teaches free moral choice. He says in the Mishnah Torah, without free moral choice, Judaism would be meaningless, because we have commandments. And if we don't have choice, the commandments are meaningless. And habit for him is what eliminates the possibility of free moral choice. In other words, to put it another way, the habit has the person more than the person has the habit. That when something becomes habitual, especially bad habit, he argues, the person surrenders their moral choice. So what Maimonides argues, and after him later they all argue like this, is that we have to combat the bad habits that take away the possibility of moral choice, and we have to inculcate the good moral habits, which are the virtues, so that they become for us like a moral second nature. So, for example, the Musar movement in 19th century Lithuania, the founder of it, Israel of Salant, said that inculcating the good moral virtues is like learning, say, how to read. Because when you learn how to read, you start out, say, by learning the individual letters, but you don't know how they all fit together, say, when you're reading in a sentence. But as you learn how to read, it becomes habitual for you to fit together the elements, namely the letters. And Salon says, similarly, the cultivation of the moral virtues works in the same way. You learn one little kind of deed this way, one virtue this way, and then eventually it becomes to you, moral behavior becomes to you like a second nature. Or another analogy he gives is learning a foreign language. When you start learning a foreign language, you know random words, you know a little grammar, but you can't fit it together. Eventually, hopefully, it becomes a second nature. And that's how he says the cultivation of moral virtue should also work. Finally, Maimonides takes what is essentially a holistic view of health. Namely, that health is shleimut. Health is wholeness. And that means the interpenetration, interconnection between the health of the body and the health of the soul. And I want to give you two citations from Maimonides on this, which I think make it clear. He writes, "The cure of many diseases is unknown to the physicians, because they are ignorant of the whole body and the whole soul, which ought to be studied also. For the part can never be well unless the whole is well." In other words, his argument is not you just cure this without looking at that, but you have to look at the whole person. For all good and evil, whether in the body or in human nature, originates in the soul and overflows from thence. In other words, the health of the body and the health of the soul are intertwined. And therefore, if the head and body are well, you must begin by curing the soul. That is the first thing. And the final quote is from his commentary to the Mishnah, where he sort of sums up the whole thing. And he says, "The improvement of the moral qualities is brought about by the healing of the soul and its activities. Therefore, just as the physician who endeavors to cure the human body must have a perfect knowledge of it and its entirety and its individual parts, just as he must know what causes sickness and that which may be avoided, and must also be acquainted with the means by which a patient may be cured, so likewise, one who tries to cure the soul, wishing to improve the moral qualities, must have a knowledge of the soul in its totality and its parts, must know how to prevent it from becoming diseased, and know how to maintain its health." In other words, you have this idea of wholeness, integration of the body and soul, and also parallelism between how you attain and preserve the health of the body and how you attain and preserve the health of the soul. The final thing I want to say about Maimonides, which is not really part of his health regimen, but has to do with some of his ideas about the nature of medical practice, which it seems to me are very up to date. First, in the treatise on asthma, he advises fellow physicians that it's necessary to see the patient not only when the patient is ill, but when the patient is well. Because you want to see how the patient is in their normal disposition. So, for example, if a person, when they're healthy, say, runs a high temperature, higher than normal a little bit, then you know this when you see the person when they're healthy. Secondly, he says, treat the whole person rather than part of the person, because the organs of the person are interrelated. In the treatise on asthma, he says, physicians are well aware that this disease, he's talking here about asthma, cannot be managed successfully without a full knowledge of the patient's constitution as a whole and of his individual organs, especially of the ailing part and its companions in pain. Thirdly, he talks about the use of drugs. And his prescription is that drugs are the final remedy. In other words, that the first endeavor should be to try to find a natural cure where the body heals itself. And drugs only come in to give the body a little help in that. But drugs should not be the first line of attack. I will give it to you in his words. In certain cases, prudence is advocated and no medicine taking should be attempted. We have it on authority of the leading physicians of our times that in certain mild cases, nature does well without outside help, and there is no need to support nature with medicine. A normal, healthy conduct of life is quite sufficient. Otherwise, once started with the treatment of relatively mild cases, one of two evils is a sure outcome. Either a mistake is made and the therapy applied proves to be contradictory to the course of nature, thus impeding the cure and aggravating the pain, or the right thing is done and the disorder guided in its normal channels, thereby teaching nature lazy ways and not to exert herself in the absence of external help. The fourth has to do with the behavior of the physician. Maimonides argues that there are three significant characteristics that a person should look at in choosing a physician. One should look at what they know, make sure they're learned in their craft, their art. Secondly, their experience, that they should have experience in doing what they're doing. And the third one is maybe a bit of a surprise. He said the best doctors are the ones who know how to doubt. To doubt.
Can you detail that?
Pardon me?
Can you give us detail on the doubt stuff?
Yeah, I'm trying to find it. Again in the treatise on asthma. In this profession, which requires experience so long that a person's lifetime is hardly sufficient to cover a part, let alone the whole art of medicine, I have indeed enlarged upon this point to make clear to your Highness, he's writing this to one of his patients who's in the royal court, to beware of certain physicians, and not to put your life in the hands of any of them just because the physician happens to be there, but to rely at all times on a healthful way of life whose principles we have already discussed. The main thing you may have learned from this is that erroneous judgment is much more frequent with doctors than is the right procedure. This is a doctor speaking. Aristotle in his treatise on natural sciences says, the first thing required of a doctor is that he learn the nature of his patient's constitution on both healthy and sick days. So I mentioned this before. Most physicians fail to establish the true facts, so in the last resort, the doctor and his remedy are to blame for the patient's death. On this point, another version ascribes to Aristotle the following saying, most people die of medicine. I have to find the, well, I'll find it eventually here. How old was Maimonides? He was about 69.
Was that a long life in those days?
Yes, it was. All right. A second point that he makes, another point that he makes, this is 5, is to treat, well, I'll simply read it because this is very clear. There is a general rule, and I have seen great physicians acting on it, that the physician should not treat the disease but rather the patient suffering from it. In other words, if you treat the symptoms of the disease, that doesn't mean you're going to cure the patient. You should try to see the patient as a whole, see why they have these symptoms, and treat the patient first and the disease second.
That was one of the things that thrown me off with this basic premise. There is much alignment around the medical system.
Well, my view is, Maimonides wrote 850 years ago, and we're now just about beginning to catch up. Two final points. One is sort of cute, I think. Maimonides had a very wealthy clientele because he was one of the court physicians at the court of the Sultan in Egypt. And he says, I have a lot of rich patients, and a lot of them are hypochondriacs. And they have this habit, every time something's wrong with them, of going to a physician, which is okay, except they go to a lot of different physicians, and they don't tell one what the other one is saying, and they don't tell one what the other one is prescribing, and this leads to a lot of problems. And the final point I want to make about his view of medical practice is his advocacy of what we would call today group practice. Or practice made up of people with various specialties. And here's the final quote I want to read to you. He says, Al-Razi says, Al-Razi was a great Arab philosopher, he who lets himself be treated by many physicians is never sure if they all made no mistake. But the author, namely Maimonides, says, this is true when all of them treated him separately. However, when they are gathered together in concilium, as is the case with kings and wealthy families, comparing their observations and deliberating on the best course to be taken, it is highly advisable and becoming. The patient has the benefit of the sum of their knowledge and ability, since no person can remember everything he learns, and this art of medicine is not easy, especially where memory is concerned. It may well happen that a physician should not be able to muster on the spot everything he might require for his patient. So here, in a nutshell, is Maimonides' plan. Are there any questions? There were some hands in the back before. Still don't see them. Okay, any comments, please?
The only comment I make is that last comment has proven itself. That's the model of the Mayo Clinic, where they practice separately from any other group practice, where no physician owns the patient. And they early on developed one of the best manual medical records. So if you ever go to the Mayo Clinic, you find yourself, your first experience is being bounced among physicians. And you essentially build up a chart, and because nobody owns you, no one physician is your attending who owns you, there's no ego involved, and the outcomes there are very high compared to other practices of medicine because of that one thing. It's a community of physicians.
Well, I have only one problem with the Mayo Clinic, and that is that they put it in Rochester, Minnesota. I mean, it would have been nicer to put it in, say, somewhere you can get to easy. Okay, any other questions? Okay, we'll take a little break now, and then we'll discuss some happy subjects like euthanasia and abortion.